So in this video, I'm going to be walking you guys through the positive crankcase ventilation system replacement in this 2000 BMW 528i. This car has the BMW M52 motor, which, as you may know, shares a lot in common with the follow-up M54 motor. So most of this should look identical, aside from a few part numbers. So you should be able to follow along just fine. And that being said, I will be linking all of the part numbers that I use down in the description down below if you want to check that out. And as you may also know, there's a number of symptoms attributed to the failure of this PCV system, including misfires, rough idle, failure to idle entirely, which is what this car is currently exhibiting. That's about as bad as it gets, as well as just a slew of various check engine light codes, which I'm sure you can find in different forums and things. Regardless, it's a very common problem with these old plastics going bad, vacuum leaks, clogged systems, the whole thing. So with that all out of the way, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So I want to first apologize for how absolutely filthy everything is. It's just that time of year where everything gets coated in pollen here. So now that we're under the hood, it's important to note that there's two ways of going about this job. One is you can remove the intake to give you better access to everything and to better be able to see what all you're doing. But that's not necessary, and that brings us to option two, which is what I'm doing, where I'm not going to remove the intake and I'm just going to feed all these hoses through just by feel. So the first thing I'm going to remove is this air filter box, and it's really easy. You don't need any tools to do it. First thing you do is there's usually a little clip here, a little spring clip that you pinch together and pull off of there that rides this little stud. But other than that, you just pull this off, really standard stuff. Go ahead and replace your filters if it's been a minute. These definitely need to get replaced, so we'll work on that. But just set that out of the way, or in the garbage, and then pop these off of here. There's these little tabs along the top that you just pop up, and that comes back and off, and that rotates and unlocks. It just pulls right out of there. And then, now this should be released. It should pop right up and thread out, and all of the tree gunk goes into the engine bay. I will be getting this car cleaned up for sale here soon, so that's one reason why we're really doing this job. So the next thing we got going on is we got to get the air box out of here, because we're going to be working up under the intake. So this is all really straightforward stuff. Start by unplugging our mass airflow sensor and just loosening these hose clamps and stuff. This one has a hose clamp that's doubled up. I'm not sure what the deal is there, but I'm not going to ask questions. And then with that loose, there's this 110mm here, and that should allow us to lift this air box up and out of here. There we go. So, I just wanted to show you real quick something that I found that's probably the real problem with why this car just won't run. That's a little bit of a split there. Well, in fact, that's quite the split. I don't think I've ever seen an intake boot that cracked. So I'm going to have to order up a new one of these. And just a note, you can get the M54 intake boots and they'll fit right on here. The only difference is they don't have this ginormous stupid baffle on them. So it's probably better to buy an intake boot for a 525i or 530i. So that's just what we're going to do. So now up in here there's another hose clamp that we have to pull off to be able to remove this. And now that I know that it is totally trash, I'm not too worried about ripping it or anything on its way out. So we'll just get this loosened up and then yank it out of there. Don't forget to pull this little guy. Sometimes all you need is a 90-degree pick to run around. Again, not worried about tearing this boot. I might just rip that. There we go. And continue to work on this intake boot here. Try to break that loose with the 90-degree pick as well. Try to give it a twist. That thing does not want to come out of there. Alright. There's that. Let's get the other end of that off now that it's torn. There we go. Alright, and now there's the second intake boot, which I'm going to first remove our DISA valve up here just to give me better access to all that, and it'll make it easier to work up in there once this is up out of the way. So to remove this DISA valve, I'm first gonna remove this connector here, which is just a pinch on this little metal clip, and then you pull straight up and set that off to the side somewhere so it won't get damaged at all. And this appears to be a T40 Torx. If you plan on doing any serious work on BMWs, it's probably a very good idea to get a set of Torx bits at the ready. And of course, this thing is really cranked on there. There we go, broke it loose. And the next one is right up under here. Crack that loose. Alright, and now that we've got that out of there, can pull that straight off. So our next order of operations is going to be removing this bracket for the throttle cable here. Now, it's not guaranteed that your car has a throttle cable. All the later cars had fly-by-wire, so it's just a little motor, a little servo that actuated the throttle. But this being an older model, we're going to have to pull that off real quick, which it appears to be held on with a 10mm and one more T40 up in here. So actually, this little hose going to the idle air control valve right here makes it so we have to remove it before we can remove this bracket, because the idle air control valve also mounts to this bracket. So it's just a really tricky, blind spot to work in to get to the end of that hose clamp. I don't know why it's spun around that way, but that's the direction that it's spun around. So I'm going to try to slip a screwdriver in there. You're not going to see it. There's no chance. I can't see it. Yeah, that's not a fun one. But I think I've got it. It's spinning. Again, I'm going to try to break it loose a little bit with a 90-degree pick. It can always be helpful to break the seal. Well, that's not going to budge either. I'm going to take this hose clamp off, which is also obscured for no reason whatsoever. And hopefully pull this whole chunk of crap off. So, patience is key with this, especially if you don't want to break more parts to replace. Alright, now take off one more 10mm here, and this should come right out. Alrighty, there we go. And you just got to separate the idle air control valve from this little gasket that goes into the intake. We'll be replacing that gasket as well. So, now, and don't forget to disconnect this connector off of the idle air control valve. It's another one of those little spring clips you just got to push in and pull off. Alright, I'll just slide the idle air control out of here. Maybe it'll all come out as a single piece. It just presses out. Alright, that's out. Okay. Now you're going to want to inspect this lower boot as well for any rips and tears. It might be a good idea to purchase a replacement in advance, just because they do commonly crack along these seams and up in these little bellows. Hey yo, man's whipping. So next up we're gonna remove this electrical box with all these harnesses so that we can then remove the throttle body here. And then we should be done removing things from up under here, and we'll be able to get to all our hoses and stuff. So I'm just gonna start by breaking loose these bolts. There are a couple of connectors that we'll need to remove. So I'll do that just in a moment before I remove everything completely. So there's that bolt up there, and then there's this little nut down here, which I guess I need an extension for. Alrighty, now that those are cracked loose, we'll go ahead and unplug everything. So the first thing we're going to unplug is this little connector up in here. And there's also a connector right down here that we're just going to pinch and pull right off. Alrighty, now we can remove these bolts and slide this over out of the way. Alrighty. Oh, and there's one more connector that is plugging into the alternator, it looks like. It's hidden up behind this power steering reservoir hose. So we'll pop that off real quick. And there's one more that runs up behind the oil filter. Pull that one off. Now with this electrical box shifted a little bit out of the way, we can go ahead and break these bolts loose on the throttle body. It might be easier to remove the dipstick tube. I'm going to try to not remove it just so I don't have to break that seal because I don't have a replacement O-ring yet. But regardless, if you want to remove that, it will make your job a little bit easier. But as far as the throttle body goes, it's just 4 bolts that will crack loose here. There's 2 up top and then 2 underneath in about the same position. I'm not really going to be able to get that on camera, but you can just trust me there. Now I'll go ahead and thread those out and we should be able to pull the throttle body off. Now we should be able to pull this somewhat up and out of here. This is all really cumbersome, by the way, and if you're having trouble with ergonomics, that is not your fault. It just is a challenge. Now, there's a connector here on the throttle body that we have to undo. That's simply a matter of twisting it to the left, and it will disconnect itself like so. Now, we can set all of this up and out of our way. And now we're done pulling crap out from under here until we start disconnecting hoses. So now back up on top, we're going to go ahead and remove this beauty cover. So now with that cover out of the way, we're going to go ahead and break this distribution rail piece loose. There are 4 T25 bolts. We're just going to loosen all those up real quick. That one and this one. Alrighty, so now we're going to pull this thing up and off of here. It's not going to come all the way off yet because there's 2 hoses that we still need to remove, but it's easier to remove them once you've brought this up a little bit. So you're just going to wiggle it ever so slightly. You don't want to wiggle it a whole lot. This is fragile plastic, you have to remember. You just want to break all the O-rings loose, like so. And then just slowly work it upwards. You want to distribute the force that you're pulling up with. And there we go. And now with this broken loose, I can show you how to remove these little hoses here. They're just sort of hoses that you pinch, one on each side, and work off of there. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get a good view for you, but you just pinch the little ring that runs around it and push it off. And there's one more back here, which is very similar. Pinch, wiggle, push. Voila. Now, one more hose that we're going to remove while we're up here is this one here. I'm just going to use a 90-degree pick to work that off of there. We are going to be replacing this vacuum line. And then other than that, the last old part that we have to remove up here is this main breather hose that plugs in right here. And it's the same sort of clip where you pinch and pull. So now back on the underside of the intake, the oil return hose that feeds in right next to the oil dipstick tube here, we need to remove that. And we need to remove the actual bulk of the PCV system itself right here. I'll try to illustrate doing all that. You can see right here there's one bolt that we need to remove, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that return line. Some of this just is really hard to try to get on camera, and I apologize for that. But you'll have no problem finding this stuff on your own car. It's not difficult to locate the stuff, it's just difficult to see it and get lighting on it. So again, I'm trying to break this hose loose with a 90-degree pick. Some silicone spray goes a long way as well when you're trying to do this stuff. The combined pick and silicone spray is like the ultimate method for removing vacuum lines. There we go. The key is just getting the pick in there and rotating it around the hose. So now with that out, we can go ahead and get up in here to pull out the rest of the unit. Alright, there's no shot I could get any of this ever on camera, so I figured I'd just show you in advance. We're working around all this junk obviously, but this is what you're trying to get out of here. There's these two puck looking things, and there's one Torx bolt right up in there. I'll get the size for you in a second. There might be another one, but I think it's just that one. It's the only one I can see at the moment, but we'll see in just a second. I just wanted to show you what that all looked like in there before I get started, because you're not gonna see anything once I start going. Yeah, definitely pull out the dipstick tube for this job. I don't have O-rings, so I'm just doing my best to not pull that out, but that will give you infinitely more space to work on this. So it does look like it's a T25 Torx bolt. There we go. We finally got a straight shot at this screw. Had to go under the dipstick tube and over this little electronics box. Now I gotta be really careful not to lose any hardware. There we go. Add it to the collection. Alright, so there's one more screw in there that I'm going to try really hard to show you. It's right there. You're looking straight at it. So that one needs to come out of there too. You can't tell as soon as you take light off of it. So there's two screws holding that in. Alright, be careful not to drop this one either. There we go. Now we should be able to fish all of this out, in theory. I'm going to remove that drain hose from the bottom of this little assembly here. And it's another one of these tabs where you squish them to pull them off. So this is the lowermost hose, the one that we separated from next to the dipstick tube. And now, in theory, should be able to pull all of this down and through. In theory, of course. Get that vacuum hose out of here. That one just kind of fell off, so I imagine that's probably been leaking. So I'm going to take this main hose off here too. Might give me better odds of pulling this out. I don't really understand why this is stuck. In all the YouTube tutorials, you know how it is, it just comes right out. But I'll be the first one to say that's not how it works. I should have disconnected this first, because now I can pull on it, but I can't pull against anything. Oh, that is so annoying. Holy crap. Alright. Alright, so it's this hose that's holding it. For some reason. I am unsure as to why. But I might be able to unclip it. Alright. Now that I have access to that, I'm going to try to break this off. Oh, there it is. Oh my gosh. So, ignore what all the YouTube tutorials tell you. Take off all the hoses off of this before you try pulling it out. If you see one of these hoses, just pull it off ahead of time. That's all I'm going to say. And we have this one last hose that should come up through the top. Again, don't listen to the YouTube tutorials. Pull as much up through the top as possible. These hoses aren't going to pull through from underneath. Alright, so now we should be ready to start installing all of the new parts. And theoretically that should be easier than removing them. So now that we have all our old hoses out, we can go ahead and start reinstalling things with all our new parts. And we're going to start up top with the spreader here and the hoses that attach to it. But the first thing before we start clipping hoses together is we're going to replace all these O-rings. So all we're going to do is work all the old ones off and then slip the new ones on there. And One thing that can be useful is you can put a little tiny bit of petroleum jelly on these O-rings, mostly just for installation back onto the intake. It'll make things slide together better, but you want to be really delicate with that because you don't want to get petroleum jelly down into your vacuum lines and stuff. But a little tiny bit will help all these O-rings slip into place. Now we just slip our new O-rings on. Alrighty, and once we have that done, these are the two hoses that we're going to hook back up to this spreader here. It's the long hose with the foam covering on it, and the short little curly Q looking one. That's the only way I can really describe it. But all we do is take this one and take the end with this little nub on it and clip it in right up here like so. Just wait for it to click, and we'll flip that over. And this hose, the end with no connector slides over this, and there should be an O-ring that comes with this hose, so make sure you have that on first. Then you slide that on there like so. Again, a little bit of petroleum jelly might be helpful. It'll help prevent you cracking anything as well. But once that is securely on there, you take the other end, and that clips right up here, like so. Clicks into place. And then, this hose here, there's a little slot in your intake right here, and it slides down through there and then veers off this way towards the rear of the car. And you'll see there's like a little channel that goes through there. There's no way I can show it on camera, so you'll have to see it for yourself, but it slots in there and goes off towards the rear of the car. And your job is just to get it through this little channel here, and it should make its way the rest of the way on its own. So it looks like you got to go 90 degrees with this spreader here to get that started, and then rotate it around. And you want to make sure that it goes through a little slot in the intake properly when you're doing this. And check your work from multiple angles, and we're looking good. Just to give you a better view of where this hose routes through, you can see there's a slot through the intake itself here, but then up underneath there's this tube here, and it needs to run over top of this tube, which you can't see on camera again, but there are angles that you can see it from up top, especially looking down through here. You can see where it needs to route. You just want to make sure that it goes over top of this tube, through the slot, over this tube. And then, once we have that, it's just a matter of pushing this down into place. So, we'll just try to be gentle with it, evenly distribute your load. A little bit of persuasion helps. And there you go. Just push it in until all of the brackets that you put your bolts go through are flush, and that's how you know that it's all the way in, and then we'll bolt that back down. And you don't have to make these things super friggin' tight, because you are just screwing into plastic. They just kind of need to be hand tight, and with a screwdriver it is plenty tight. There we go. And don't forget to tighten that little hose clamp that we put on this hose. So now that we're just about done with everything on the top side of the motor, all the easy stuff, it's time to move on to the tricky stuff, which is getting this valve back up under the intake manifold. And I just thought I'd walk you through the orientation and what goes where before we go burying everything back in there. So this faces this way. Front of the car is this way, rear of the car is that way. This is facing out from under the intake manifold. So this right here is what the long tube that reaches up to the valve cover itself plugs into. That tube snaps on here. And then this one up here is what the sort of curly Q looking tube plugs into that goes up to the spreader that we just rigged back into place. This right here is where the return line for the oil down to where the dipstick tube meets the engine hooks up. And then this here is where that one long skinny vacuum hose that we are still going to replace plugs into here. We'll replace that after we've got everything generally back into place. So again, I'm going to try to generally show what I'm doing to get this back up in here. Remove your dipstick tube. It's not worth trying to leave it in place. Just take it out. I'm not, because I don't have an O-ring and I'm not trying to dig this back out again. So I'm definitely making it harder for myself. Take the dipstick tube out. All right, so feeding this back in here, you kind of have to figure out where all the screws mount up. You do have to feel around just a little bit for that. So I found the upper screw hole with my thumb up in here, and it's right next to where the curly hose came down to, and so that all checks out because that's where this ends up lining up. So you're going to want to try to work that hose, plug it into this valve, which that's probably the hardest part of all of this. So it seems like it's probably beneficial to run one hand around the front side of this tube here to work this hose while you wiggle everything else into place. And you just want to be patient. That's all you got to do. That's probably the most valuable tool for this job, is patience. So it feels like I've got that lined up, and I'm going to try to work that into place. So looking at the old valve and hose, it does look like the connection is a twist rather than a clip like the rest of them for whatever reason. So that's definitely going to make things significantly more difficult, although I don't understand why it won't just clip on like that, but I have been unable to make it do that so far. So it's a twist. So essentially, if this hose is mounted here like this, and you're trying to install this, you have to rotate it all the way parallel to the ground, connect it, and twist it down into place. Which, I don't even know if that's physically possible, but if there's a will, there's a way. Other people have done it in the past. It's gotta be doable. So, it appears that I was able to get it. You kind of have to get the connector on the hose itself pulled back out of the way, and that valve's got to go as far as you can physically rotate it this way, and you bring the two carefully together, feeling them with your fingers, and then pray and rotate that valve back down. And you can inspect it by feeling whether or not they are conjoined, because there's a gap here, and you can feel whether or not the nub on the valve has gone into there. And once you can verify that, because you do want to verify it, you don't want to put this back together like, yeah, maybe, I think it's right. But once you've done that, you should be good to go with that hose specifically. And next up, I'm going to mount up this return line. You kind of have to feed it through everything back down to the nipple that you can see down here, down next to the base of the dipstick tube. I'm going to connect the top side first, routing it through everything, making sure that I'm not getting tangled up on anything. So we're just going to run it down and then take the upper end of it, clip it onto our valve here. Again, our valve is just sort of free floating. We don't have it actually connected yet, screwed into place, bolted down, and that's just because we want to make sure that we get all these hoses attached first. So that's clipped in. And one more note with that oil return line is you want to make sure that it runs underneath this coolant hose right here. Over top of this big cross member, but underneath of this coolant hose and behind the dipstick tube and all of that stuff. And now down bottom, we'll take the bottom end of the hose and lift it up onto that little nub and work it back down into position. Which, once again, a little bit of petroleum jelly wouldn't hurt for helping to get that seated. But you just kind of wiggle it on there and wiggle it till it's all the way down and seated. Cool. That's 2 of 4 hoses. So our third hose and last somewhat tricky hose is this one that runs down from the valve cover to that valve, the lower part of the valve. That just sort of feeds through here like this, clips on here up top, click. And so back on the underside, you can't really see very well, but there's where the other end of this hose here goes. You want to get that out in front. There we go. And gently work that on there. Fortunately, you can just kind of get your hand right here and give it a push. But it does take quite a bit of a push to really get that seated. There we go, and you just push it until you hear that click. And once you get that audible cue, you know that that is all mounted into place. And so, last hose we have to connect before we just start reassembling everything is this piece of narrow vacuum line here. And we're just going to route that up through underneath the intake and cut it to length. So I'm going to start by just connecting it right here to this little nub on the assembly, which is now mounted in there like this. And once you have worked that on sufficiently, we're just going to route it up through the little slot that the curly hose ran through and connect it back up top. So I'll walk you through that real quick. So I'm actually going to use a tool to route through from up top and try and grab it from under here. But just trying to feed it through, it's not a really long distance. You can just kind of shove it through and then grab it from up here with a pair of needle nose pliers or something like that. But this is what I'm going to try, and I'll let you know how well it works. I just have to get it through the slot between the upper part of the intake and this tube here, get it through that little slot, and then I'll be able to grab it and run it the rest of the way up. And this hose not really being fitted, it makes it not really matter a whole lot which way you run it through. So you don't really have to worry about this one. It's just kind of a whatever fits will work, as long as it's not kinked. I'm gonna grab this hose there. I'll try to make it right way around. Make sure that's secure and pull it up and through. Be gentle, don't want to tear it. And voila. Now we gotta pull up the rest of the slack through there. And pull this all up through the top. So now all I'm going to do is adjust this to what looks like an appropriate length. You can leave a little bit of slack. There's no reason to pull it up tight. But that looks about right, so I'm going to just cut it right there with my really dull knife and slide that right back onto here, like so. And there you go. And at this point, we should be ready for reassembly, just reattaching everything. But go around one more time, make sure all of your hoses are connected properly, securely, actually on there, because the last thing you want is to try to do this to fix vacuum leaks and end up with bigger, worse vacuum leaks. So double check, be patient, and we'll jump right into reassembly. So the last thing we're going to remove is this little gray grommet right here, which is actually this little piece of tubing. And this is what the idle air control valve mounts up to. If you don't really know what all the parts are, that doesn't really matter. But we're just going to pull that out real quick, which should be as easy as coming in from the top with a flat head and prying down and out. And it should work its way out just like so. We can pull it the rest of the way out by hand. And note the orientation, it curves off to the front of the car. So we'll put the new one in that same orientation. Just poke it in, curl it around, and give it a shove with our palm. And that'll pop right into place, just like so. So our first real step of reassembly is going to be remounting this valve to our intake. So just for the sake of positioning things and making it easier to reassemble things, I definitely recommend putting the bottom most of those two screws in first. But just find your screw hole, feed the screw in, pray that you don't drop it. And I'm sorry, this is blind on camera too, but I do have clear vision of it. It's just I can't fit a camera in as well to show what I'm doing, but if you pulled it out, you know what I'm doing. It's the lower of the two. So that one's insecure. We'll get the top one. And there's no need to use like an actual ratchet on this. Again, you're screwing into plastic, so hand tight is plenty. It's not like the screw's gonna back itself out. And having good lighting is important too. I definitely recommend having a good flashlight that you can properly position to see what you're doing, because that makes a world of difference. You can actually see what you're doing. It is possible. I don't see the reason to really take off the intake. It's not like you can't see or reach anything. Alright, so that is mounted back into place, and that's good because that's probably the most difficult piece to get into place. So next I'm going to remount the throttle body. We are going to have to replace this gasket here just to ensure that things seal properly. So we'll pull the old one out and we'll slip the new one right back in. There we go. And so next thing, if you have a car with a cable throttle, you just want to make sure that this cable stays seated in this groove here all the way through this process, or at least by the end of this process. Otherwise your throttle is not going to work properly. But that being said, we'll go ahead and slip this back into place, and we want to make sure that we plug this back in here. And this plug, it lines up with these arrows here. Plugs and twists all the way until the new arrow is lined up. There we go. Alright, now we can squeeze this in here. Work that down into place. We'll get 2 bolts. We'll hit 1 on each corner just to get things lined up. You just kind of want to get them started with your fingers, just because it is difficult to get everything flush. It is a bit of a strange angle that it actually mounts up with. It's not flush with anything visibly. There we go, that's all mounted up. And we'll get our idle air control valve, which now is a good time to service this if you need it, to clean it out. This one, everything is moving freely, so it's all ready to go right back into place. So just for positioning this, the connector goes towards the front of the car, and these 2 ports are differently sized, and that's because they go to 2 different sized connections. And so the narrower one is the one that goes up into that grommet that we reinstalled into the intake manifold. So we will slide this in here like so. And now, make sure our throttle cable is wrapped around the little groove properly. You can just sort of press it into place. And again, some petroleum jelly would probably go a long way for mounting this up. And now we will re-bolt everything back into place and plug all the connectors that we undid back in. And I'm going to start with those connectors just so I don't miss anything. And for rerouting them, you shouldn't be able to mix them up because they're either very different lengths or they have a different number of prongs. So just use that in your favor as you do this. So this one here hooks up to the idle air control valve because it's short. There's only one way around that you can plug them in. And this one I know mounts up here, so I'll plug that one back in. This cable, just kind of running around stray in the engine bay, actually plugs into this electrical box itself. So we'll clip that in. This one mounts back up here. This 3-prong one mounts up to the rear of our alternator. And I couldn't figure out for the life of me where this connector plugged in. But one thing you can do is sort of use the shape of the cable itself to figure out where it routes. Just shove it around until it moves freely. And I found the connector all the way up in here, and we'll just clip that back on, and we're done for now. These last 2 connectors that come out of the top here, this one plugs into our DISA valve, and this one plugs into our mass airflow sensor. So now we're going to mount this bracket back up, and again it's held on with 3 T40 bolts. Thread 1 10mm nut on the bottom, and then I guess this bolt goes through here. So now we'll take our lower intake hose and mount that up here. We'll go ahead and tighten this hose down. Alright, that's got it. Now we'll remount our DISA valve, which is held on by 2 T40 bolts, and it goes with the chunky side towards the front of the car. And these don't have to be super tight, they just need to be snug. And we'll reconnect this connector. Now we'll install our upper hose here. Now we'll work this air box back into place. Get our beautiful doubled up hose clamp back on here. And we should be able to work this the rest of the way on there. Gotta be sure to plug our MAF back in and hook this vacuum hose here back up. And we'll tighten this ridiculously long hose clamp back down. Then we can't forget this one up in here. Then we'll mount this back down and we're done. Then we'll throw everything else back together up top, starting with this beauty cover. Then we'll throw this stuff back in. Take this duct, slot it in. Rotate it into place. And then flip it back on. Filter in. Cover on. Latch that. And now we are officially done. Whew! So since this was a more challenging repair, I just wanted to leave with some closing thoughts. First of all, I'm sure that the more times you do this, the more straightforward it gets. For me, I ran into a couple of hiccups along the way. All I can say for you is be patient, be thorough, double check everything, and just make sure that everything is seated perfectly. You don't want to be redoing this. Second thing, a lot of people suggest taking off the intake for reasons that it's easier somehow, that you can see things better. I'm sure you can see things better, but after doing the job and having hiccups along the way, I think I can say definitely you don't need to take the intake off. Just leave it on. Unless you're shooting a YouTube video maybe, it might be more helpful to see more clearly how things run. But for you doing it yourself, there's no reason to take the intake off. You can access everything just fine, and you can see everything fine, honestly. Everything is plenty accessible. So that being said, once you do this repair, it should be a one and done. You should never have to do it again, likely for your ownership of the vehicle. And so that gives me some peace of mind with this, that everything that frequently causes vacuum leaks, that'll make the car not run properly, has been corrected. And so that's one step forward in selling this car. And lastly, I will be doing this same repair on an M54 in the future because my sister's car has an M54 that also needs this to be done. So if you want to see those specific part numbers, everything looks pretty much identical. But if you want to just see how that goes as well, there will be a video up on my channel on that here soon. So subscribe if you want to check that out. And for all the parts and stuff that I used in this video, check down in the link in the description. And until next time, I'll catch you in the next video.